Hi, Glenn Peoples here. Although I haven't discussed it on this YouTube channel, or at least not yet, elsewhere I've written about and I've spoken about the moral argument for God's existence. And this is the argument that the existence of moral facts, that is, the existence of facts about our moral obligations, is only appropriately explained by including God in the explanation. Moral facts they're not natural facts. They're not things that belong to the field of physics or chemistry or biology. They're not like mathematical truths or things that are just true by definition. And moral obligations express the will of God, calling us to act or forbidding us from doing so. Moral properties are properties that natural facts just don't possess. I remember having a radio discussion with philosopher Stephen Law about his evil God argument, an argument that I didn't find especially powerful. And in that conversation, I brought up the moral argument for God's existence. And the only thing that Dr. Law offered by way of rebuttal of that argument was to say, well, some philosophers, like Christian philosopher Richard Swinburne, don't endorse the moral argument for God's existence. Now, that's not much of an argument, but that's what he said. In social media, not all that long ago, it was on X, maybe it was a while ago, I forget, I saw the account called Real Atheology, which I believe is run by Ben Watkins, I think it is. And that account posted a video of Richard Swinburne saying why he didn't accept the moral argument for theism. So it looks like there is this kind of sentiment every time a Christian brings up the moral argument for theism, that the sentiment is because there is this great Christian philosopher, Richard Swinburne, who doesn't accept the moral argument for theism, we should think twice before accepting it ourselves. I don't think much of that kind of appeal to authority. They're appealing to a man, these atheists, I should say, are appealing to a man who they genuinely don't agree with. They think was wrong about his conclusions about God. So why are we supposed to just suddenly think he was right about this? But in any event, let's take a look at the response that Richard Swinburne offers to the moral argument for the existence of God. And I have to say, and this may be the effect that people are hoping for when they point out that Richard Swinburne, of all people, doesn't accept the moral argument for theism. When I first learned that Richard Swinburne had this case against the moral argument for theism, I hesitated before commenting on it, because I made the mistake of thinking that, well, there must be something that I'm missing, because I certainly don't have the experience in philosophy that Richard Swinburne does, and yet here he is making this argument that I think is really bad. Well, I think it is not deserving of his great reputation. Perhaps that's the way to put that. But I actually don't think I was missing anything. I think that Richard Swinburne's rejection of the moral argument seems to me anyway like a weak spot in a generally brilliant career in philosophy. So I want to give Richard Swinburne space to speak clearly for himself, and he has done so. Here's a clip of him explaining why he doesn't think much of the claim that God explains moral facts. And this is from a conversation that he had with Lawrence Kuhn in the Closer to Truth series. And you'll see that I've edited the video so that it's not too long. But if you've seen the video before, or if you've just heard Richard Swinburne explain what he thinks, you'll see that I am faithfully depicting his view on this. Take a look.
So the discontinuity between the existence of morality and its lack of capacity to infer or prove an existence of God is caused by the fact that morality has an independent, necessary existence?
Yes, indeed. That must be the case. Just whenever anything is wrong or good, there is a reason why it's good. Things can't just be good. They have to be good for some reason. Why is it bad, for example, for me to kill you? Well, because killing ends life and I can't bring you to life again. But suppose killing didn't end life. That is to say, suppose when I stick a dagger into you, you would become unconscious for 10 seconds and then you would revive again. In that case, killing wouldn't be wrong, or not very obviously wrong. So, as it were, me killing you on a particular occasion is wrong because no one has the right to take away life permanently from someone else. Right? And so any particular action being right or wrong depends on it having certain features, and any action which has those features is right, or as the case may be, wrong. There couldn't be another world which was just the same as our world, except in the respect that promise-keeping was good, and killing was good, and feeding the hungry was bad. If these things had different moral values from what they have in our world, that other world would have to be different in some other respect, e.g. in the absurd way I've suggested that killing might be different. Okay, so there are necessary truths of morality.
Therefore, you cannot use it to infer the existence of God.
That is right, any more than you can infer the existence from the fact that 2 and 2 make 4, because that is a necessary truth. It's true whatever the world is like, and it's true whatever the world is like that it's good to feed the hungry. It would even be true even if there weren't any hungry and there wasn't any world. It would still be true that it would be good to feed the hungry. Meaning, if there were any hungry, it would be good to feed them. And necessary truths are not evidence for anything because they hold in all circumstances whatever.
Now, there are some issues that I will overlook, even though they are quite important, because I want to address the main argument, or the one that interests me. But there is a real lack of precision and some potential confusion in some of the words used in this interview, especially when it comes to the way that it seems to me that Swinburne just ignores or removes, or perhaps doesn't believe in, the distinction between goodness and rightness. Feeding the poor, for example, serves certain goods, but when we talk about it as a moral requirement, Richard Swinburne uses the word good, but actually when we talk about it as a moral requirement, we're not talking about what is good, we're talking about what is right, what we ought to do, which is a different concept. Now, some things are good, but we're not morally required to do them because perhaps we can't. If you have nothing with which to feed the poor, for example, then although it would be good for you to feed the poor, you can't be required to do it because you can't do it, right? This distinction, although I think it matters generally, doesn't matter for what I want to say here, though. So I'm just going to not get too picky about that and ignore it. So Swinburne's main line of argument is that while there are some specific moral obligations that we have, underlying these are more general, basic moral obligations. And these are necessary truths. That is, they're true in every possible world. And because they're true in every possible world, well, that makes them like mathematical truths, such as 2 + 2 = 4, and there is just nothing that explains them. And since nothing explains them, well, then God doesn't explain them. So basic moral truths are not explained by making reference to God. And so the moral argument for theism, well, it fails, doesn't it? But really? If moral facts exist in every possible world, does that prove that they are independent of God? As soon as I became aware that this is what Swinburne was saying, it struck me that this is just not true. This is false. The fact that something is true in every possible world doesn't mean that it is independent. That's the word that Swinburne uses. It doesn't mean that it has no explanation or that it can't depend on God. Given classical theism of the sort that Christians throughout history have embraced, God is a necessary being. God would exist in every possible world, or else it wouldn't be a possible world. And so it's quite possible that something might depend on God and be explained by God, and yet still be a feature of every possible world, because God's there. God's in every possible world. And this is not a novel concept among philosophers. I'm not pulling something out of a hat. Alvin Plantinga, for example, in his book, Does God Have a Nature?, discusses necessary truths that nonetheless depend on God's nature. For example, if it is essential to God that he be omniscient and God exists necessarily in every possible world, then necessarily, i.e. in every possible world, God knows all truths. But that necessary truth depends on God's nature. So a number of philosophers have in various ways proposed that there can be truths that hold in all possible worlds that are necessary in that sense, even while they're being true in every possible world, is not an independent fact. That still depends on God. Philosophers like Thomas Morris, Christopher Menzel, or Brian Leftow. Put simply, and I know I am kind of repeating this, but I hope that helps to make things clear sometimes when you repeat something often enough. Maybe. If God exists in all possible worlds, as classical Christian theism maintains, then there will be some other things that are true in all possible worlds as a result of God existing in all possible worlds. For instance, God is omnipotent. He is all-powerful. And so the proposition omnipotence obtains, that is, omnipotence is instantiated, to use a great philosophical word. That proposition is true in every possible world, but it's only true in every possible world because God, who is omnipotent, exists in every possible world. So we can distinguish between at least two types of necessary existence. On the one hand is what you could call absolute necessity. And this is the sort of necessity that God has, existing in every possible world and depending on nothing. Then there is what you could call dependent necessity, which may sound paradoxical, but it's not. These are things that are true or which exist in every possible world, but only because of some other necessary thing. So if there are necessary moral truths, basic moral truths that are true in every possible world, actually they can be used to infer other things. There are other things that could explain them. And the fact that they're true in all possible worlds does not mean that they have no explanation. That's simply false. It isn't enough to say that they are true in all possible worlds. It's not just enough to say that they are necessary truths. You have to offer some reason for thinking that these truths couldn't be dependent on something else that is necessary, like God. So Richard Swinburne, I think, has not offered a good objection to the moral argument for God's existence at all. In fact, this occurred to me as I was listening to him. If basic moral truths exist in every possible world, all that means, I think, is that in every possible world, you could make a moral argument for God's existence. In every possible world, you can argue that since there are moral facts in that world, those facts are explained by the existence of God. And bear in mind, I'm not offering a moral argument for God's existence here in this video, so don't fault me for not doing that. Don't sit there and be like, well, you haven't offered any reasons for thinking that that's a good argument. I know. That's not the purpose of the video. I'm only responding to Swinburne's specific objection to the argument. And so we are still within our, we might say, intellectual rights to say that since moral facts are not natural features of the universe, they are non-natural in nature. And the best way to think about non-natural moral facts is to think about them as the product of a non-natural person who brings moral facts about. And that's because of the way that moral facts are like commands. In fact, I think they are commands, calling future states of affairs into being and seemingly expressing the desire of an authority. And since this non-natural person, God, exists in all possible worlds because he is absolutely necessary, and God has the same nature in all possible worlds, it is true that there will be some basic expressions of God's will that will be the same in all possible worlds, but nothing about this means that the moral facts do not depend on God. So I think Richard Swinburne was wrong.